So hello everybody, welcome to the Alternet seminar, and this time we're talking about being uncomfortable, so I hope you're sitting comfortably. And in this, I guess we're encompassing anything from inconvenient truths, awkwardness, even personal stress, interpersonal conflict. All of these can be linked to the idea of discomfort, and in everyday life most of us instinctively back away from this, but perhaps we shouldn't. It's hard to say. Too much discomfort certainly tends to shut down debate, perhaps, rather than foster openness. So kind of navigating this issue is certainly not straightforward. Today, we're going to focus on this issue in relation to science policy interfaces for sustainability, aided by some excellent panelists who I will introduce in a moment. But first, I'm going to hand over to Professor Maurice Hoffman to introduce Alternet and its seminar series. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry, for introducing me. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome on this fourth webinar in our activity on science policy interface. The last one was in February on the very disputable, seems policy-wise, nature restoration law, and now we have got a new item on hand organized by Kerry. I just give you some words on what Alternet is about. Alternet is an organization which started in 2004 and still exists, started with financing by the European Commission, and is by now self-supporting organization representing some 32 member institutes, pan-European, all over Europe, and I mean pan-European sensu lato. That means that also United Kingdom partners are well represented in Alternet. We've got all kinds of activities. One of these is the summer school, dedicated every year to issues around biodiversity and ecosystem services. But there are plenty of other activities such as conferences, SPI webinars, high impact actions, and call exchange to inform our member institutes on upcoming interesting calls, mainly by the European Commission. Those 32 member institutes are very diverse in expertise and in number of employees, but I can say that the total of those 32 member institutes represent some 9,000 employees, all one way or another active in the topics that are relevant for Alternet, that is the relation of policy making and biodiversity issues in a very broad sense. If you want to know anything more about Alternet, I refer to our website, which you can check. That is alterneteurope.eu. Where you can find all about what is Alternet about. Of course, if you want to join as a member, as an institute, not as an individual, unfortunately, then feel free to check on the website where you can find all information on joining Alternet. I wish you all a very fruitful webinar, and looking forward to the contribution of the three speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurice. So just to come back to the topic of today's webinar, why we're here today. And I guess it's because we all agree a huge scale of change is needed to achieve more sustainable and just ways of living. So this has implications for all human societies and economies, and achieving this is unlikely to be easy. And some have suggested that scientists in particular, but also others, need to get more out of our comfort zones and expect to be more provocative, perhaps, expect to encounter or even provoke discomfort to help achieve these changes. I encourage those of you who haven't been to some of the previous seminar series to have a look at the one in June 2022, where Esther Turnhout presented on this particular issue. So there's lots of reasons why it's easier not to do this, of course, not to get uncomfortable. Anything from our individual professional roles and through to personal attributes, our organizational mandates, and our accountabilities. And even if we do it, it's hard to know if we've chosen the right moment to be uncomfortable or get uncomfortable, and to know if we did it right. It certainly can feel awkward, and I speak from personal experience. So we need to think a bit more directly about this subject, I think, and that's why we're here to do today. When should we expect to encounter discomfort? Is it linked with certain underlying issues? What's the reasons why things are tricky and uncomfortable? When should we accept or even expect to provoke discomfort? And how should we handle it? Who's well placed to do this? Today, we're going to get to the bottom of this with our excellent panelists. We won't cover all aspects and angles of discomfort, of course, but between them, they have quite a variety of perspectives. So I'm sure we're going to learn a lot. The running order for today is that we're going to have 5 to 10 minutes of reflections from each of our panelists. We're going to go in alphabetical order because that's as good as order as any. So we're going to go with Peter, and then with Eva, and then with Bob. And then we're going to move into questions both from me and to each other, but also from you in the audience. Please leave questions as we go in the chat. And I realise at the moment you're all boxed in as attendees and you're unable to speak, but we can release you from your box later on if that's helpful, if you would prefer to voice your questions verbally and be more active. So, right, I think it's time to get going with the first speaker. Although I should perhaps introduce myself. You didn't come here to hear from me, I know that, but you might be wondering how this happened. I work as research lead on environmental governance at the James Hutton Institute up in Aberdeen. I work a lot on how we can encourage joined up approaches, anything from integrated catchment management through to nature-based solutions. And I spent a lot of time reflecting on, studying and occasionally publishing on science policy interfaces, but I don't claim to be perfect at this. And I certainly have encountered my fair share of awkwardness and not known if I was doing it right or if awkwardness was actually something to lean into. So I'm hoping to get some answers today, some ideas and inspiration at least. So let's see how we get on. And I realise there's a plane outside my window because Aberdeen is a major oil hub. So if the plane is a problem, I'll shut my window. But first of all, I'm going to hand over to Peter. So Professor Peter Bridgewater, he currently chairs Wildlife Health Australia, but has previously directed the Division of Ecological Sciences in UNESCO, chaired the UK Joint Nature Conservation Committee, and has extensive experience of science policy interfaces, including chairing a range of intergovernmental bodies ranging from the International Whaling Commission through to UNESCO's Man and Biosphere Council, one of the conference of parties to the Ramsar Convention, and he currently assists Australia's work at the IPBES, so that's the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And I'm sure I've missed lots of things out there, Peter, but over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. I'm very pleased to be able to take part in this exercise because I think, as some of your remarks at the beginning mentioned, we need to be a little less comfortable. But what I want to try and do by starting is give a couple of examples of areas where I actually was uncomfortable and the reasons why and what the outcomes might have been. But first, just a couple of notes from me. We talk about science policy interface with P being policy, but we often forget that P is politics, and it's the politics that actually start making people uncomfortable. Policy itself is rather bland or can be rather bland, but politics is about implementing policy, developing policy. And if any of you have worked in and with government, you will understand that while there are room for policy development through the so-called policy cycle, most policy is developed by sometimes irate politicians having read something in the newspaper and wanting it fixed. And the other point I want to make that's often gives rise to discomfort among scientists who prefer to ignore it is that science is never value free. We always try to pretend that science is this super form of knowledge that actually has no value attached to it. This is, of course, nonsense, and it's particularly the case generally in the environment. So the first discomfort I want to talk about is a role I had a few years back, which was as supervising scientist for the Alligator Rivers region. Nice title. It's a small area in northern Australia in the dealing with uranium mining in Kakadu National Park, World Heritage Area. Now I can hear indrawn breaths already. How can you have uranium mining in a World Heritage Area? Well, you can if you actually grow the World Heritage Area around it. We haven't got time today to explain all that, but basically the World Heritage Area that's Kakadu National Park has a hole in the middle in which there was previously uranium mining. And one of the issues that came up was there was an ongoing uranium mine, which my organization at the time had the responsibility for monitoring. And we did a reasonable job, I think. But there was a new uranium mine that wanted to be opened up. So what happened? We got together, looked at the issues, and came to a conclusion that actually there were no issues that compromised natural heritage values, and I emphasize natural heritage very particularly, and you'll see why. At the same time, the World Heritage Committee was looking at this issue, and IUCN, who is the technical advisor to the World Heritage Committee, influenced by one of their NGO members, had made a firm statement that opening up this new mine would be disastrous from a natural heritage viewpoint. So there was an immediate clash and a lot of discomfort for me and my staff. This went through various iterations through different committees and a lot of discomfort along the way. In the World Heritage Committee itself, there was a view that, well, maybe it should be on the list in danger. And so they sent a team to evaluate. More discomfort because the team that came to evaluate very clearly had a view formed before they even started to evaluate. And that was very clear, unfortunately. So we went back to the World Heritage Committee, which then said, well, we think it should be on the list in danger. The Australian government had conniptions that they did not wish this to happen and argued strongly against it. And then the World Heritage Committee appointed a 3-person group that unanimously supported our work. That group came from the International Council on Science. So in the end, the World Heritage Committee said, it's fine. There are no natural heritage issues. This group was right. But that whole process of creating discomfort was, I think, interesting because, first of all, it showed up that the advisory body, supposedly neutral advisory body, was not in fact neutral. And the advice it was providing was not basically scientific, and that science, when it gets involved in the politics of the issue, becomes really, really difficult to manage. So that's one particular point I wanted to issue. The other one, and I'll make this rather brief, it occurred when I was looking at the whole issue of the International Whaling Commission. As you probably all know, the Whaling Commission agreed a moratorium in 1986 on all whaling, and that was largely agreed with because it was seen that populations of all whales were declining very rapidly, some heading, like the blue whale, to extinction. But the population models that were being used to monitor this all said there were no problems. However, and so the moratorium was brought into place. There was no more whaling in a direct sense, and that was a position maintained until 1992, when the Russian Federation took the seat that had previously been occupied by the USSR. And the Russian Federation representative revealed that over a period of decades, there was duplicity amongst the Russian Federation, amongst the USSR reports to the Whaling Commission in terms of the whales that they had claimed they were taking as opposed to those that they did take. And if you back calculate, there was in fact nothing wrong with the population models. But like all models, if you put garbage in, you get garbage out. So there's a whole area of science there which actually caused the moratorium to be put into place. I'm not saying, and I'm certainly not arguing, that we shouldn't have had the moratorium. What I am saying, though, is that for the moratorium to have been put into place on the basis of bad science, indeed science that was actually duplicitous, was a really big mistake. And that's caused a lot of discomfort. Basically now, for 30 years, the International Whaling Commission has been dysfunctional. and remains dysfunctional, unfortunately. So those are my two areas of discomfort where I personally should have been uncomfortable at various times. Maybe I should have been. And I think I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, well, I'm sure that's generated lots of questions and desires to know more from everyone listening. But we're going to move on smoothly now to Ava to talk about some of her experiences and her ideas. So Ava, thank you for joining us. Ava Hernando Herrero leads WWF's Living European Rivers Initiative. So as you've probably noticed, she's not based in academia or claims to be a scientist like some of us on this call do, but she uses science, has worked with science. And I think many scientists sometimes look at the civil society or look at the third sector and think, oh, well, maybe they're the ones who are going to fight the battles and it's not for us. So I think Eva will have an interesting reflection to add to this conversation. And Eva's worked in the Doñana wetlands for many years, where, of course, there are many problems with illegal water use. So Eva, over to you. Thank you for sharing your ideas.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a luxury to be with these two other speakers here today. Yeah, I've been many years working in Doñana. Our organization, WWF, started working there already in the 60s. And since then, we didn't lift our eyes from the area. And we continued seeing how intensive agricultural expansion was threatening the protected areas. We saw that the fires were provoked, burning forest around the protected area and were slowly transformed, or too fast to transform, in fact, into farming land, strawberry farms. I bet most of you have heard in the news this conflict right now with the regional government wanting to legalize farms there. So this is this is not that the origin of this, but it was when we tried to start solving this problem of illegal farms expansion. Some of the farms expanded legally, of course, but most of them illegally, occupying natural land or transforming rain-fed crops into irrigated crops and digging holes illegally, which completely impeded to be able to manage water in the area and ended up having impacts on the protected area. So we started denouncing this. Of course, like, you go to the media, we as NGOs, that's the first thing we do, no? We make an analysis, we use scientific techniques behind our work, because we always say that WWF is a science-based organization. We don't want to invent anything. This is not a religion. We need facts to convince people. Even though to convince people, we know we need to go through their hearts, but we know also that we need a solid scientific base. So that's what we did. We studied what was happening. We followed up the farms that were being burned and denounced that they were being transformed into strawberry farms. But then we wanted to travel in time, and we used satellite images to travel in time and see how much they had expanded. And it was really scary what we saw. So we denounced it publicly. I'm talking around 2003, 2005, that time. So 20 years ago already. And well, we were heavily criticized by everybody. Even the Minister of Agriculture at that time criticized us and called us publicly liars. And well, that was really an uncomfortable moment, no? When you know you have the truth in your hand, you're not inventing anything, you have something that anyone can replicate because it's Landsat images anybody can access. And then there's a minister criticizing you, and you find that nobody goes back and support you. It is uncomfortable to be criticized when you know you have the truth, and it is even more uncomfortable to feel alone. Look around and say, hey guys, where are you? No, you're the ones that can certify I'm not inventing anything. And that's a moment where we would have liked to have some support from science. Linked to that, we knew that this illegal farm increase was causing the groundwater level to decrease, and that was having a direct impact on a protected area that's mostly wetlands. Wetlands that it's not a mountainous area, so the water for the wetlands comes either from the rain or from the aquifer. No, there's no choice. So we knew that there was an impact of farming on groundwater, and there was an impact on the ecosystems. it was very, very difficult to get, I mean, we grabbed all the articles that we could, but it was very difficult to get statements from individual scientists to say, this is wrong, this is having an impact. And this, for me, I was desperate because we knew that we were losing species already in the area, and we knew the impacts that we were having on the evolution of vegetation. You could see that, no, when you went to the field and also in aerial images. But I was unable to find, well, I did find some people, but it was very difficult to find people that supported this thesis that the lowering of the ground table was affecting biodiversity. At the end, my lessons learned there was that you need to dilute responsibilities because it's very difficult for an individual scientist to go and speak up. Well, some do, but many don't. I'm sorry, I have to say this. I know I'm creating discomfort now, probably. What we did is, okay, we organized a workshop, Chatham House rules. Guys, you can say whatever you want. Nobody will know it was you who said that. It did work. However, you always need to rely on the scientific papers because it's not only what you say in a workshop, it's the scientific method that's behind it, it's the peer review that's behind those articles that give them strength. And sometimes we do find the articles that support our thesis, that support what we want to promote, the changes in policies, as it was in this case, or in policy implementation. But sometimes we find that the research is not responding to the questions that are most urgent. So my key message would be that as relevant as it is to help provide answers to NGOs or to governments or to media, because sometimes we know they also approach scientists. And yesterday, a scientist friend was telling me, oh, but I'm fed up. I mean, they're calling me all the time and I'm tired. And this is, I feel it's like a waste of time. Well, I don't think it's a waste of time responding to media or to administrations or to civil society, because we need answers, but as much as we need the answers, we need the right questions. And I think we can also help in NGOs and CSOs, we can help in identifying what are the questions that need to be put on the table, and we can later help translating those results in a language that's more easily understandable by media, by the average citizen, or by governments.
Okay, so an impassioned plea for the scientists to be a bit braver and not to forget civil society organisations as part of the jigsaw puzzle of achieving change. So moving swiftly on, please do remember to think of any questions and leave them in the chat or any comments. Moving on to Professor Sir Bob Watson, who have quite a long list of things that he's done and been. I'm not going to cover all of them. So he's currently with the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research in the UK, but in the past has worked for a variety of organisations, ranging from the World Bank to links with UK government and, of course, academia. And he's played a key role in many intergovernmental processes and international scientific assessments, with some of those past roles including chair of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, chair of IPBES, as was mentioned earlier, co-chair of the Millennium Assessment, and chair of the Global Environment Facility, so that's GEF, Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel. So again, I've probably missed out many things there, Bob, but over to you.
Thank you for having me today. First, let me say I have never felt uncomfortable, even when challenging powerful political and private sector voices, even when I've been the only single voice on a congressional hearing arguing for change. Why? I base all my arguments on good scientific evidence. The point is, telling truth to power is always inconvenient and normally causes discomfort. Why? We're telling governments, the private sector and civil society that the world is unsustainable, that environmental change is undermining human well-being of current and future generations, and we need to radically transform our economic and finance systems, our productive systems, especially energy and food. Telling scientific truth has been the role of international assessments on ozone, climate and biodiversity for the last 30 to 40 years, and I've shared all of these. yes, the findings are quite inconvenient and they have caused discomfort. We are losing stratospheric ozone, or have been. We are changing the world's climate, and we are losing biodiversity at an unprecedented rate. These messages were not well received and certainly were viewed to cause distress at the highest level of governments. I can certainly talk about that from the UK and US. It caused distress in boardrooms of large industrial multinational companies and in the public. Why? Governments and the private sector often like the status quo. There are vested interests everywhere, not only in the private sector, not only in governments, but also in the public at large. And we have to recognize that. In general, people are comfortable with the status quo and change is challenging. So, for example, to meaningfully address the climate change issue, we need to totally transform the way we produce and use energy and the way we produce and consume food. This has major implications for governments around the world, major implications for the private sector. Governments don't want to incur costs in the short term to transform the energy system. The private sector, there will be winners and there will be losers. But equally, while the public at large say they want change, they don't want to pay anything more for energy and food. They don't want to be taxed. And they often don't want some of the technologies in their neighborhood, like solar power and wind power. So the public have got vested interests just as much as governments and the private sector. So even when there are cost-effective and socially acceptable response options, when we've identified, there's nearly always opposition from a myriad of people. The stratospheric ozone story is the one exception and the most successful story today, where we have phased out long-lived and medium-lived chlorine and bromine containing species. Yes, we've made some progress on climate change and biodiversity, but it's totally and utterly inadequate. And so one of the questions which has already been raised, is the scientific doing a good job of informing and pressuring stakeholders to do the right thing, whatever the right thing might be? But before answering that question, I think it's important to note that scientific evidence is a necessary but not sufficient condition for informed evidence-based policy formulation and implementation. Scientific evidence is only part of the information a decision maker needs to address complex issues such as climate change and loss of biodiversity. I certainly base this statement in my time as a senior scientific advisor to the US government, the UK government, and the World Bank. And in both IPCC and IPBES, our philosophy was be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. There's many ways to solve a problem, and therefore one outlines policy options, but not being policy prescription. So, in my opinion, IPCC and IPBES provide the scientific evidence needed to address issues like climate change and loss of biodiversity in, as I've already said, an economically and socially acceptable manner. Some scientists argue that these assessments are not proactive enough. However, I would argue there is a very fine line between giving scientific evidence and advice that is evidence-based and relative to being an advocate for change based on ideological positions rather than hard, credible, defensible evidence. In other words, we need to base our arguments on good evidence. And if we don't, unfortunately, I think we will lose. Rhetoric and emotion is important, but rhetoric and emotion must be based on good scientific information. So I indeed am a huge supporter of IPCC and IPBES. However, on occasion, I think they can sometimes need to be more realistic and recognize real world truths. And what I mean by that is, for example, the IPCC 1.5 Celsius report argued that it is still technically feasible to achieve the 1.5 Paris climate target. I agree, no question. At that time, it was technically feasible to meet that target, But there was no chance of ever meeting that target because the vested interests around the world, both inside government, inside the private sector, and the public at large, was stopping the actions needed. And so the real world isn't what is the technical potential for a solution. It's what is effectively not even what is the economic potential. It's what is the real world market potential. And the politics come into it. And I do feel in that case, the IPCC should have said more explicitly, yes, it's still technically feasible to meet this target at one point, but governments, the private sector and the public are not taking the actions needed and not likely to take the actions needed to meet those particular targets, basically. And so we are going to miss the target. We're on a pathway to 2.5 to 3 Celsius with dire consequences for ecological systems, socio-economic systems, and human health. Equally, the Aichi biodiversity targets were clearly, none of them were fully met and totally predictable in advance. There was no way that we were going to change the pressures of exploitation, land and sea use change, climate change, invasive alien species, and we could have spoke out more. The academic community said, you can change this and you can change that. We should have been more forceful, possibly saying, these are not likely to change, and therefore biodiversity will continue to decline, which it is at this moment in time. And therefore, there's no question, these assessments are incredibly valuable, but on occasion, I think we need to make our statements maybe a little bit clearer, maybe a little bit more forceful, and we need to continue speaking the truth, which will be uncomfortable and inconvenient for many people, but not just government, not just the private sector, but the public at large. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. And yeah, it's a kind of depressing situation. I guess I have one question for all of you, but is how or who exactly in the scientific community should be acting differently? We can talk about science, but of course science is done by people employed in organizations, varying grades, anyone through from a PhD student to a professor with tenure. And I don't know that everybody in those organizations feels equally empowered and able to act, but I guess, do you have a particular group, a particular type of scientist or particular roles in mind that could be doing things differently? Please, any of you just jump in.
Yeah, okay, I'll just jump in. Look, I think this is a really good question and central to what I think all three of us have basically been saying in slightly different ways. The scientific community and the policy community and the political frames in which all of that operates need to have more regular conversations. Bob is talking about the assessments, and these are important, but they're punctual, i.e. period-based events. There needs to be more continuous conversation, and there needs to be more continuous contact. There are some scientists who do this, but they're in a rarity, and far too many scientists become too uncomfortable and stop being scientists and actually start being more emotional about it. You can argue that, well, the situation is really serious, we have to be emotional. I think what Bob has said, and I agree, is that you need to have the passion there, which Ava was exhibiting quite properly, but you actually need to have it based on reality. And you can't do that by just doing it suddenly. It has to be built, the confidence has to be built over time. And there are arrangements that various parliaments have put into place to bring scientists in more regular contact. But again, these tend to be annual events, and people turn up, they have one day kind of big session. Everybody goes away thinking that they've converted everybody, and in fact, nothing has really changed. So from my perspective, I think there needs to be much more regular, continuous contact And that's something I believe not our generation, my generation, Bob's generation, maybe even Ava's, but the generations coming through are more capable of doing than we ever were.
I can add something to that. I agree fully with Peter. I think there's 3 or 4 points I would quickly make. First, these big global assessments like IPCC and IPBES, they also need to be complemented by national assessments. And so, in fact, and I chaired 2 assessments in England called the UK rather, not England, UK National Ecosystem Assessment. So we brought it down. What were the relevant issues for England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland? So we sort of went to a finer scale than the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So we need national assessments to complement international assessments. We do need continuous interplay, as Peter has said, between government and science. I recognise we also need it not only with government and science, but the private sector and science as well. And I don't know how to solve that one. So in the UK, when I was the chief scientific advisor for DEFRA, every government department had a chief scientific advisor. I was the chief scientific advisor for DEFRA, Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And there were scientific advisors for all the other governments. We met once a week to discuss what we were telling our ministers. Now, to be effective, those chief scientific advisors had to have access to the ministers. They had to be on the most senior management panels of that individual agency, and I was on both. And they had to have some control, macro control of the budget, which I also had. So that way, we could actually put day-to-day input into science decisions, and we could understand what advice was being given from one government department to another, basically. And so what can scientists do? Be involved in these types of things. Talk to the media. And the media is incredibly important. Use the social media, which I actually don't, but also give presentations to the public, etc. So the key point is use your scientific knowledge to inform all relevant stakeholders, and that is the media, the public, government, and the private sector.
Ava, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would like, well, two notes. I wish politicians really received advice from scientists, and I think they need to get used to it. It's not in every place where they do it, they do it, and it's very sad to see how they take political decisions because they need to take them, but not with all the knowledge that's available out there, and completely biased. Maybe they get scientific advice, but they completely biased and only taking one piece. And I think Bob, you were presenting the full scope of the challenge that we have ahead of us. No, you cannot focus on one slice of the challenge. You need this holistic perspective, and it's not only one scientist that has to provide advice. It's a team, an integrated team, and not only minister by minister. But I think it's amazing that you got together also to agree on how you were going to approach the topic. So that one thing, we need politicians to get used to receiving advice, of course. I'm sorry, I forgot about the other thing I was going to say. I'm enjoying really listening to you. Sorry.
That's fine. It happens to all of us.
It will come.
Bob, are you?
Let me make another point, though. But what you also need are politicians or ministers that are open to advice, open to being challenged, and not all of them are. I mean, I've got several stories, but one, my minister was going to go to Japan, basically, at the time where they were going to discuss what became the Aichi targets. And the UK government position at that time was the same as the European position, and that is we need to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2020. Now, my minister was new. She hadn't been talking to the other environment ministers in Europe. They'd already got the position when she suddenly was made environment. And so I was in a meeting where she told myself and the other civil servants what the position of the UK government would be: support Europe, halt and reverse the loss. And I said, that's stupid. It's the most ridiculous policy position I've ever heard in my life. And she said, well, why? I said, well, look, what we're going to see between now and 2020, economic growth. We're going to see an increase in the world population. there will be an increased demand for goods and services. This will mean we're going to continue to get land and sea use change, continue to exploit plant and animal species. Climate change will absolutely continue to increase. Pollution across the world is still increasing, and we're seeing ever more purposeful and accidental invasive alien species. By 2020, I can almost guarantee you there will not be any significant decrease in any of those drivers. So she actually took my comments and my notes. I gave her some notes to the cabinet, and they then had to reassess what their position was vis-a-vis the rest of Europe. And I pointed out to her, India, China, Brazil, the US would not go along with halt, because they also realized it was impossible. She was totally and utterly receptive to hearing my statement that the UK position and the European position made no sense. And indeed, when they put the Aichi targets there, they're much more nuanced. They were superb. I like the Aichi targets, but they didn't have this stupidity of halt and reverse, basically. And so you do need ministers that are willing to listen to being told they're wrong. It's often the way you tell them they're wrong. And you then have to give them, what's the solution? What should your position then be?
Yeah, I think that reminded me what I wanted to say before. Sorry. I think it's very important how you say things, not only what you say, but how you tell them. Because if at some point, if you're too negative, then the discomfort is so big that people just shut down and they don't continue listening. When you talk to a government, if you come with the figures about the finance impact of the decisions that they have to take, I think that's the biggest language that they need. But if you go to the average citizen out there, with the upfront with this, we are all going to die, it's very scary. And what's a trending topic in social media? For sure, it's not climate change. No, it's a football star or a TV star doing something fun. So how we pack our messages and to achieve the audiences with the scientific base, which I think it's a luxury and can make any message really shine out there compared to just gossip. I think that's very relevant.
So I totally agree that in the kind of achieving transformative change, it's not just about scientists. We can't save the world, or sort of arrogance to assume that we could sort of change everything simply by providing a package of evidence. I guess just some of this discussion is naturally focused on what scientists can do because it relates to the audience and to the Alternet consortium. I just want to pick up on the point of listening, though, because we say that the politicians, getting them to listen is really important and not always something that we're able to control. But equally, is there a role for us as scientists to adapt and listen? Or is that too cowardly? I don't know. I guess sometimes it's not just about us broadcasting a message cleverly.
It's about conversations. It's absolutely about conversations, because this is part of the problem. We're seen as different camps, and there hasn't been enough attempt to have these conversations. Sometimes you can find, in my experience, I've had one minister who was really receptive to listening and talking about issues and talking through issues. Most of the ministers, however, come with either preconceived knowledge, or they're too junior and they come with predetermined cabinet positions, and you can't argue them out of that frame. But you can eventually get around that by actually making contact with ordinary politicians, if I can put it that way, that is MPs rather than necessarily ministers. And if you can corral enough of them, you can actually influence some other ministers. So that there are ways to do it, but it is about conversation. And the word listen is so critical. And I'm afraid I think many scientists are not really happy at listening. That's their discomfort zone, or our discomfort zone, if you like. We really don't like to be told that it's, that's not what it is. But of course it actually is. And so that I think is the critical issue and the critical entry point. But the most discomforting thing is what Bob has already said, which we know that we are on trajectories that are not being discussed. Even they're not played out, even by the most competent authorities, as it were.
I couldn't agree more with Peter. We must learn to listen. Most scientists, or many scientists, don't understand the political process. They don't understand what a minister is there for. Why have they been selected? What are the challenges of that minister? So you have to be able to understand, both at a national and international level, the political process. Why is the minister saying that? Why is the minister taking that position? And if you can get inside their thought process, they will start to listen to you. So, for example, another little story, when I was in the World Bank, had a great relationship with Jim Wolfenson when he was the president of the World Bank, a real Renaissance man who understood the role of the World Bank. But then we went to another person after Wolfenson called Wolfowitz, and suddenly the issue of climate change was totally taboo, totally taboo. And why? The Republican administration at the time absolutely was fighting everything to do with climate change. And therefore, Wolfowitz, who used to be in the administration, when he came to the World Bank, climate change was off the radar screen. So I was talking to his senior advisor, a woman called Robin Cleveland, and I said to her, she asked me what I thought the most important issue for the World Bank was, beyond obviously addressing poverty alleviation. I said, it's climate change. She says, no, definitely can't talk about that issue. It's politically dead. I said, damn it. All we're talking about is making the energy system low carbon, which will be good for everybody. Oh, she said, we can talk about low carbon. That's got no political sensitivity at all. I then worked incredibly well with her, and even indirectly with that Wolfowitz, of not talking about climate change. How do we transform our energy system? How do we actually adapt to climate variability without using the words climate change? So in other words, by listening to what was their political red flag, there were ways to deal with climate change by saying, I'm going to address this from a different way. I'm only going to talk about renewable energy and why that can transform the system. How do I adapt to natural variables? Don't even have to talk about climate change. And so listening is important.
I just want to point out the irony of a conversation about listening when it turned out that we'd accidentally disabled the chat for the participants, so no one could ask us questions. We couldn't listen in. But I think everyone should be able to do that now. I see there's a good question in the chat, but if not, maybe Ava, you'd like to respond first, and then we'll pick up the question in the chat.
Yeah, I wanted to build a little bit on what Bob was saying. I think we at NGOs, we have this contact with politics, no? And we're doing politics all the day, most of us, no, in NGOs and CSOs. And I would like to make a call for scientists to count on us to help, as I was saying before, on making the right questions and helping understand the context. And we usually feel very sad at the office when we are approached by some scientific institutions to be partnered in a Horizon or a LIFE project or a JEF project, and they always consider us for the same road. Oh, you do very good communications. You take care of the communications package. It's like, okay, we can do something else. We can also be in the kitchen to help think how the research is being done. We cannot, our role is not only to translate this and do a layman's report. No, there's much more than we can do on understanding this political context and reasoning behind the positions of certain politicians.
I like that phrase of being in the kitchen. I guess I'm going to pick up the question in the chat, since someone's actually succeeded in using it. And this is from Ben Delbare. It says, have any of the panelists experience with scientific evidence being discredited and challenged by alternative truths? And do you have any advice on how to deal with that?
All the time. I mean, on the climate issue, the climate deniers, people like Bjorn Lomborg and others, a whole bunch of, even some good scientists have actually challenged with actually bogus science. All we can do is listen to their arguments and then show why they're completely specious. But no, I mean, false science has been a major issue in dealing with the climate change issue, probably more than the biodiversity issue, in my opinion, for the last 20 or 30 years. So the climate deniers take an ideological position. They either make up their own science or they find something that's slightly wrong in the model, and they exploit that one minor issue, for even if the other 99% of, say, the real world simulates the model. No, it's something we've had to fight continuously, and we'll have to continue to fight it always.
What is especially scary is when that alternative truth comes from otherwise renowned institutions, and we also had that, no? So good universities, good scientific bodies coming up with a report that goes against the truth, and because there are financial, I mean, economic interests behind, because they were paid as a consultant to say something, and they say it, and the best way against it is, yeah, I mean, it's coming with the counter arguments, and I think for us, what worked is go with more scientists. So if one scientist says something that's not true, then you come up with 20, not one, no, and different arguments, and you try to break to build counter arguments from more angles. So there's no way that can escape. You need to really close the circle so it doesn't bounce back.
It disturbs me, I have to say, that there's certain credible scientific institutions that are coming up with things that are dodgy, if simply because they've been paid by a particular group. But I guess it does reflect this issue that science rarely gives us one fact. I mean, there's often a certainty, but there's often little uncertainties around the edge of an issue, or there's competing opinions. I'm thinking now about some debates about sustainable intensification of farming. Do we have high intensity farming and spare the rest of the land for nature, or do we try and get that? Some of these issues rumble on, and there's not necessarily a single clear truth that comes from science. And I guess that often makes it harder to sort of navigate, and I guess it provides more excuse to push back against. It's everything's uncertain, or nobody knows. We're going to just wait.
Yeah, but that's the excuse of the coward, and you can't do that because well, you can do it once or twice, but then you cry wolf, and nobody believes you, and whole bodies of evidence are refused. To go to the question specifically, if I can go back to my whaling story again, if you do a thought experiment on what would have happened if the USSR had not been misreporting for decades and the model was quietly working in the way it should and did and could, what decision would the world have made in the mid-1980s about whaling? Would the world in fact have said, well, okay, you know, whaling is not a conservation issue? And this has been part of the problem, that whaling has been focused as a conservation issue on the basis of all these poor quality evidence bases, when in fact the much stronger arguments are on animal welfare issues, and these are advanced sometimes, but it's been advanced largely in terms of conservation. And the result is now we've got essentially a whole convention on whaling, which is totally frozen. And the one nation that wants to and continues to whale, particularly, is no longer party to the convention. So the whole process, from the science right through to the politics, with policy in the middle, has basically collapsed for that particular set of species. And it's not somebody, and I'll say this at great risk, but in my current role, a vet, a wildlife vet in one of the states in Australia, said to me at the last meeting, you know, we might have to look at what we're doing with whale populations, because part of the problem is the whale populations have now rebounded so well, but actually in different species relationships, that there are far more ship strikes. So we're having wounded whales with bycatch issues, and there's more strange stuff about whale beachings. So we've created a situation where we've stopped whaling, we've removed that horror, but at the same time, we might have created a new horror. And all of this is on the basis of misinformation and bad science. Not only bad science, but simply appalling science. So yeah, I don't have a solution to that, but I think the whole issue is we have to be very careful about making utterly definitive statements, and scientists very often make utterly definitive statements without putting the guardrails around, or alternatively make statements that are so guardrailed that no politician can make any sense of it, and they just walk away. So, you know, those are the two things we have to try and avoid.
There's definitely
Let me
some
pick-
hard. Sorry, I was just to say, no. Carry on, Bob.
Yeah, let me pick up on the uncertainty. I think it's actually very important that we as scientists do talk about uncertainty. The other word I prefer is our confidence limits. Because let's say a few years ago, I think it was probably about the third or fourth IPCC assessment, we said that all of the projections of climate change were probably between 1.5 and 6 degrees Celsius, or 1 and 6, I forget the exact number we had. And so people said, so it may be as low as 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's great. Yeah, but it could have been as high as 6. So do you want to risk that the world would warm 6 degrees centigrade, and it's equally probable as the 1 degree number? So it is important to talk about uncertainty or confidence limits and talk about the implications for policy. What we've found is that some uncertainties, even big uncertainties in science, are not particularly important from a policy perspective. But other uncertainties that can be quite small can be actually incredibly important for policy. And so I think it's really important for us as scientists to actually talk about what we know, what we don't know. And IPCC and IPBES both do that and use uncertainty language, because if we don't do it, the politicians themselves can actually be frozen into uncertainty. The second quick comment is that I agree completely with Peter. You can look at the whaling issue from a sustainability standpoint or a moral standpoint. And actually the whole issue of loss of biodiversity can be looked at not just as an environmental issue, but it's an economic issue. It's actually a development issue. It's a security issue. It's a moral issue and an ethical issue. And there's many, and I think actually we're moving the debate on both climate change and biodiversity of no longer simply looking at these issues as environmental issues. These are much more important. They undermine all of the sustainable development. And there's an underlying moral and ethical issue here, a whole series, not just one, whole series. Distributional issues between poor people and rich people, poor countries and more affluent countries, etc. So I think we're framing these so-called environmental issues in a way that resonates more with both governments and actually the private sector and the public at large.
Let me go back to the uncertainty issue, because I think it's very relevant. I mean, I do agree that scientists need to set or explicitly expose the limits of their knowledge, but you cannot stay there. You need to propose a solution. And it was already said. No, you cannot say, "Oh, I'm not sure." Well, I'm not sure, but considering how sure I am and the risk that we have, then you have to play with more uncertainty, but you still need to do politics. So what do you suggest to do? And sometimes I laugh, let me use that term, when we talk about uncertainty in science and we have a whole bunch of money being invested in stock markets with much bigger uncertainty that we have around climate change, and still everybody's putting their money there. Even small family, their savings, big companies, all their money, and it's moving. So I think uncertainty may be overrated. I think, and we should also recall that, no, that what uncertainty and also apply the precautionary principle. It was said in the chat box, we don't always have all the science, and maybe it's not as accurate as it should be. And yeah, maybe we don't have it. What we know is that things are not going better, no? How can we make them better? And I think as relevant, let me insist on this idea, as relevant as identifying the problems is putting solutions on the table. I think that's key. And that can also come from science. And then politicians take decisions. That's their role.
And some of what you were saying there about how we frame issues, this is a moral issue or a security issue, it's framing, and it's also perhaps speaks to the type of sciences that are needed to get involved. And disciplinary mix has often historically been dominated by natural scientists in some of these debates about sustainability, but increasingly not, perhaps. And I see a question which relates to this in the chat from Simone Martino. He says, what is the role of economics, for instance, the cost of implementing a policy and influencing decisions of policymakers, according to your knowledge and experience? So is the euro, the pound sign, is that always the king, or are there other things that matter too?
You have to realize that after the head of government, the most powerful minister in most governments in the world is the Minister for Economics, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, for example. So he's in number 11 Downing Street, right next to the Prime Minister in number 10 Downing Street. Yes, the Defence Minister is important as well, but the Economic Minister has amazing power. So when I was in the World Bank, or when I was actually chairing IPCC, when people would ask, if you go to a foreign country, who would you like to talk to? There was only ever one answer. I would want to talk to the economics minister, because they control most of the politics. They control most of the policies, basically. And I think we're having more and more success recently, showing that GDP, yes, is a measure of economic growth, but it's not a measure of sustainable economic growth. And so more and more people are recognizing you do need to bring into the equation that natural capital, human capital, as well as built capital. So no, economics is crucial. And that's why the Nick Stern report many years ago now said the cost of inaction is more than the cost of action. And that actually got people to think far more about the climate issue.
Peter, if you give your answer, and then there's one from the chat, which I think is a good one to help us start to wrap up, because we are coming towards the end of our time at 1:30.
Well, I was actually going to. Are you talking about what can the average scientist do? That question.
Yes.
Yes, I was actually going to sort of just gliss from the economics into that. But look, yeah, very quickly on the economics, because I think Bob's really covered that. It's without doubt. I mean, I would disagree with Bob only in the sense that I think that the economics minister is actually the most important minister. The prime minister often thinks they are, but this is not the case. As always, it's the one with the checkbook that matters. And so, yes, getting to that department, if not that minister, is really crucial. But the issue about what can the average scientist do, rather than, if you don't have access to ministers, and I'm going to frame this into not for climate, but for biodiversity specifically, because biodiversity is such a local issue, the most important thing to do is get to know the local politician and take with you in getting to know them some local biodiversity issue. I mean, it may be, as in Ava's case, a wetland that's under threat, really under threat. Talk to them about it. What are potential solutions? What are the potential problems, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, if they're known, if there's a kind of opposition politician that's in waiting, as it were, or turns up every time at the ballot, talk to them as well, because governments change, not as frequently as we might like, but they do change. And getting the opposition well informed before they go into office is really good. We have a situation in Australia where it's now over a year since the government changed, but not enough work was done on the opposition in order to get them to make sensible policies. And they picked up a lot of things that look green, but actually are not terribly practical. It's much better than what we had, but there are actually going to be downsides if they implement the kind of policies that they're actually talking about. So make it local, talk to the local politicians, and then you'll find that you'll be invited in and offered advice and so on. And some parliaments, like Australia, UK, other Western countries, have what are called parliamentary groups, where groups of parliamentarians themselves coalesce around a central theme and talk about it. And this is both the government and opposition, and form useful positions that they can then take to the government, either to the minister or what have you. And that's another very useful way in.
Yes, as a personal experience, I remember I once in a research project had a very challenging, uncomfortable time, shall we say, attempting to talk about the nexus to agricultural policymakers in Europe. But I actually had much better success setting up a kind of breakfast event, they call them, at the European Parliament, with an existing group of parliamentarians who were amenable to discussing the issue, shall we say. And up until that point, I'd always thought that liaising with the kind of equivalent of the civil service was easier or safer. And I realized then that actually sometimes there are other ways in. It requires creativity, of course, and a bit of homework and a bit of thinking, but that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, I translated just in do good science and be vocal. I mean, don't shut up ever, never, ever.
I think there is a power dimension here, that some people are perhaps better enabled, or that, they've got more resources, more time. Someone who's on their first postdoc, maybe, they're going to be losing their position in 2 years. Maybe their organization is not super vocal. I think we need to be mindful that not everyone is super well empowered to be doing loads of stuff.
We all have a brother-in-law, I mean, we all have an uncomfortable brother-in-law or sister-in-law, family gatherings when they talk, oh guys, it's this drought in Spain, like I had last week, this drought in Spain and you're demolishing dams, are you crazy? So you have to breathe, get some patience and explain. So be vocal, because this is it's our family, it's our friends taking decisions about who is going to be the next politician, being the prime minister or the minister of finance in our country, So I think not keeping what we know for ourselves doesn't help. And I think at the risk of being annoying to the people around us, I think we owe that to ourselves and to this planet.
Mm-hmm. Because I know when let's call them, my brother-in-law gets annoying, sometimes I just switch off and I don't want to talk anymore. So I think this is there's a serious point though, isn't there? There's a kind of tightrope to walk in terms of building relationships that allow us then to be annoying, or to sort of start to reframe the conversation. And that's a challenge given the urgency of some of the scale of our challenges that we're facing, isn't it? We feel something's urgent, we need quick change, but actually we need to sometimes get trusted, build a relationship before the groups we're trying to influence might be willing to hear more provocative and less comfortable things. No? Peter?
Well, I was actually waving away a fly, so which was encouraging, because it proves that we're not yet in total insectageddon. But just to pick up on this, yes, it is. It's our family. But the other point that I think is also worth making is not just to talk to your local politician, because that really is a good way in, but also to try and talk to not necessarily the civil service, although they can be helpful, but the people in the minister's offices. And these are the people that actually give the advice to ministers. Minister, you should do this because there's a column in the newspaper that says if you don't do X, then we're going to be in trouble. Not in trouble from not doing X, but they will lose votes at the next election. And that's the critical thing. You have to translate maybe in your mind what your science means in terms of votes. And if you can do that, you're onto a winner.
Yeah, we talked about being uncomfortable. This is probably the most uncomfortable I've been. I've never agreed so much with Peter in my whole life. I mean, again,
it's frightening.
Really,
it's frightening.
really quite disconcerting, actually. He's absolutely right. Too many scientists, I see it in America or even in the UK. I want to talk to the minister. No, if you can, fine. Talk to the staff of the minister. That's the person that writes their speeches. And often, especially in America, on the staff, if it's an important minister, there will be people who understand economics, science, livelihoods, etc. Find the right person and get a relationship with them, because they will then talk to the minister and they will open the door maybe to have that conversation. So yeah, do not be arrogant and say it's only the minister or no one. talk to the staff. I couldn't agree more with Peter.
Okay, well, this is positive. We're building harmony. I guess it's now time for final last thoughts. I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying and I'm hearing we need to be patient, but we need to be proactive. We need to be annoying at times, but we also need to be constructive where we can. We need to handle uncertainty. We need to acknowledge it, but not kind of be defeated by it. And yeah, we need to do a bit of research about who it is we're trying to engage with in order to achieve change. So be this ministries or whatever, another group perhaps. Are there any other final last thoughts about how we can handle discomfort? We've covered a lot.
No, what I would say though, and I think this is a failure of some NGOs and some of the scientists, they're looking for perfection. They want the perfect answer. My view is as long as we're going incrementally in the right direction, that's what we should be aiming for. But quite often, certain people, certain NGOs are saying that's not a perfect solution. No, we're not going to get perfect solution. So we need incremental change, and we should applaud people and say, look, this is, you're moving in the right direction, but not far enough. In other words, it's a carrot and a stick. Applaud them for moving in the right, but then encourage them that they've got to go that next step, basically.
For some reason, I find myself thinking of parenting my 5-year-old that, you know, if he manages to get slightly less porridge down his front, I reward him for that rather than complaining because he still has a few stains. And I guess we all respond to that. We're all human. Nobody likes to hear too much criticism, and we need to acknowledge the good. Peter and Ava, any other last thoughts?
Not really. I think I share Bob's discomfort in the fact that we have agreed so much in this whole session, which actually goes to show that we always actually did agree with each other. It just wasn't necessarily that obvious. But I also wanted to say to Ava that that I really appreciate what she has said and what she's doing and her group is doing in Doñana. It's a very important area, and it's also an area where it's got so many titles. You know, there's bits of World Heritage, Biosphere Reserve, Emerald Site, which all goes to show that these labels are again political. They're not useful in the end, because if they're not solving the problem, and people think, oh, it's an emerald area or it's a biosphere reserve, that we don't need any problem. Whereas the strawberry farmers next door are just throwing down the water is really bad news. So all power to you, Eva, and good luck with your next move.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. It's true that Doñana is a very bad example because it has the luxury of having the Estación Biológica de Doñana Biological Station, and you have been contributing with them, I know. And having this whole set of scientists working on the area, and we know that technicians and practitioners in the government are not really using the science that they have and not using the scientists that they have next door. So it's really sad. And it's in this case, it's very much linked to the fact that they think that putting a fence to a protected area just saves it. And we know very well it doesn't. And it's the context, it's the areas around it that are harming it. So my conclusion here would be we need to be brave and remain optimist, because otherwise we just go around the corners crying. I think optimism and thinking that we really can change something. And I invite science to work together with NGOs as much as I chase scientists to work with them. And then I also posted in the chat box an online petition to be supported by scientists to ask the regional government in Andalusia to listen to science and not take stupid decisions regarding the legalization of illegal farms around Doñana. So if you could also help by signing this petition and disseminating it further, we want to get support from everywhere in the world. As Peter was saying, this is World Heritage Site, Ramsar Site. I mean, it's everything except geological site because they didn't look at it, but I bet it could be. And still it is at the verge of collapse. So any help from anywhere in the world, this is World Heritage, let's support it.
Okay, so let's all start by signing petitions, but also think bigger. I think on that note, we're going to wrap things up. thank you so much to the panelists, all of you, for coming and lending your thoughts. I've really enjoyed hearing all your stories, and I'm certainly got lots of food for thought for future. If anybody in the attendee list, or indeed the panelists, have any further thoughts, feel free to drop me a line, because we're always thinking about future Alternet seminars where we can continue particularly interesting themes to help us solve all the world problems. That won't be hard. Okay, well, on a positive note, go and sign the petition. Think about what you can do, even though there's lots of things we can't always fix. I thank you all and hope you have a good afternoon. And thank you again to the panelists.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.